There was a Pharisee named Nicodemus, a leader of the Jews. He came to Jesus by night. Please be seated. A couple weeks ago, as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was raging, Malcolm mentioned what an unusual honor it was for Grace Cathedral to feature a stained glass representation of Martin Buber. It's on that side of the cathedral. One of the greatest Jewish theologians of the 19th and 20th centuries. He rightly pointed out how Buber's theology of the I-thou relation made it impossible for the Jewish leader to ever fully embrace a vision of Zionism that resulted in anything less than a peaceful binational utopia. When we take that basic binary of I, thou seriously, the I, thou, you and me, the I, thou, I and God, it has the paradoxical effect of breaking down the many dualistic assumptions we may hold in the literal face of the unknowable other. Something that seems notably missing from our world right now, probably because it complicates the easy caricatures we all prefer to the complex realities we actually live in, and the many accountabilities that naturally proceed from them. I want to highlight another feature of the cathedral's architecture that is both surprising and deeply encouraging, calling us to account, I believe, in this moment. Not something that's present, but something that's absent. When you enter our doors, you are not greeted by a very common sight in most medieval cathedrals. Most medieval cathedrals welcomed throngs of illiterate Christian pilgrims with an image of ecclesia and synagoga bounding either side of their great doors. As pilgrims looked up, they would have seen ecclesia, a young and virtuous woman, her head held high, crowned as she stared confidently forward. Holding a cross in one hand and a chalice in the other, she was the triumphant personification of the church. Synagoga, by contrast, was depicted blindfolded, her bare head cast down as she slumped to one side, a broken spear in one hand and the tablets of law slipping out of the other. She was the personification of the Jewish people and their religion, derelict and defeated. For centuries, Christians looked with scorn upon poor synagoga, as ecclesia seemed to do the same, giving a little side eye, out of the side there. She making her the original Regina George. Ecclesia was the mean girl of mean girls, initiating entrance into an invisible burn book of hate-filled rumors, insults, and false accusations against the Jews that would make even the plastics blush. So yeah, I'm glad we don't have that. But before we go patting ourselves on the back, I want you to observe, and actually, of course, the building isn't cooperating the one day I really want to make this point. But typically, if we're not in the season of an equinox as we are now, as we get closer to the solstices, you will notice that one side of the building gets more light than the other. Which side is that? You can point. Yeah, good. The south side, right? Very good. And who is up there on that big south transept? Who is that right there? That's Jesus, isn't it? And who's over here in this north transept? Oh, isn't that David? David and the prophets, Jesus and the apostles. I mean, I actually prefer the north transept, to be honest. I think it sort of twinkles in the evening. It's really beautiful. But it is rather striking that anti-Judaism of John's gospel is literally enshrined in our space, whether consciously or unconsciously, embodying that most classical of Johannine dualities between light and dark, the imputed Christians and the Jews. There is only one other character besides Nicodemus in John's Gospel so closely associated with night. When Judas Iscariot leaves to betray Jesus, the Gospel records in 1330, and it was night. Judas's name is the Greek version of Judah, the basis for the Jewish designation. Nicodemus reminds us, perhaps uncomfortably, that anti-Semitism is Christianity's original sin. He is a kind of narrative proto-synagoga, unwilling to admit what he knows is right, slinking about in the shadows, and veiled to the spiritual things for which later church fathers would accuse him of having a fleshly mind, interpreting Jesus' born-again saying as a literal physical rebirth. He is hapless, he is helpless, he is the perfect canard. Jesus even scolds him. Are you a teacher of Israel, and yet you do not understand these things? But is it really Jesus speaking in this text? From the earliest days of the church, John's gospel has been acknowledged to be different, overtly contradicting earlier gospel accounts to score important theological points. The earliest Christians often referred to John's gospel as the spiritual gospel, and with good reason. Notice that Jesus' voice suddenly and inexplicably shifts from the first person singular to the first person plural, from I to we. Very truly, I tell you, we speak of what we know and testify to what we have seen, yet you do not receive our testimony. I wonder what our lectionary is up to here. On this Trinity Sunday, are we supposed to infer that Jesus is giving away his Trinitarian identity, the triune we? Or is this perhaps a less exalted moment, a momentary slip in the narrative voice? Has the author of John's Gospel, in his supersessionist zeal, accidentally broken the third wall? Is the we placed upon Jesus' lips not the proto-ecclesia, the forerunner of the ecclesia image in the medieval cathedral? The collective self-understanding of the Johannine ideology that sees itself in direct and dangerous conflict with the Jewish religious leaders, whom this gospel records are expelling Jesus' followers from the synagogues. When exactly did church and synagogue part ways? It's a live question. While it's true that John's gospel overwhelmingly characterizes Jesus' opponents as the Jews, New Testament scholars are also quick to point out that Jesus and all his followers were presumed to be Jewish in John's gospel, that confrontations between Jesus and the religious authorities often constellate around their faithful observance of Jewish festivals, that Jesus is called the Lamb of God at the outset of the gospel. And he even proclaims to the Samaritan woman that salvation is from the Jews. Instead, many scholars acknowledge today that the term the Jews in John's gospel likely refers to the religious authorities of Jesus' day. Here they make analogies to contemporary usage of Democrats and Republicans, for example, in our national discourse. When we use those terms, much of the time they are shorthand for our political leadership, not for the constituents. Like many mainline churches, we at Grace often translate the Jews instead as the authorities. And while I reluctantly agree that the term probably meant something like the authorities, I also want to push back on this assumption. Because John's supposed writers and redactors had the option to use that term, and in fact do use that term several times, including in today's passage in the same exact line, in fact. When we hear that Nicodemus is a leader of the Jews, the word translated here is authority, is archon. If John had meant authorities, he could have used archontes instead of eudaioi. In fact, Paul developed a pretty sophisticated theology of the powers, principalities, and rulers in his letter to the Ephesians to describe the forces opposed to Christ. In other words, by the time of John's composition, there was already a decades-old theological precedent to use the term archons. So why did John deliberately use the Jews instead? I think there's a little theological gerrymandering going on here with our subsequent revision of that term. What would it mean if John knew exactly what he was doing? The disturbing implications of that question are at least as much behind our revision of the term as any attempt to retrieve a more nuanced meaning based on context. John's "the Jews" is like the verbal Confederate monuments marring the landscape of our devotion with a constant memory of our sinful past. We may not like it, but there it is, staring us in the face. Anti-Semitism is indisputably Christianity's original sin. We took a family feud over the meanings of monotheism and Messiah and literally demonized the opposition. Now, I wish I could say there's no need to rehearse that history, but based on what I'm seeing in social media, I'm not so sure. So let's just take a moment to remember together. Importantly, Christians didn't invent anti-Jewish sentiment, but they did perfect it. Already by the time John was written, Greek, Roman, and Egyptian chroniclers had written disparagingly about the Jewish people. In the ancient world, it was considered rude to insist on one's own God, antisocial to keep kosher, and grotesque by many to practice circumcision. When the Jews rose up against Rome in 135, Hadrian mercilessly slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Judeans, built a temple to Jupiter where the temple had stood, and renamed the province after its preferred Greek appellation, Palestine. Hadrian did all of this to try to wipe out the memory of the Jews from that region and from the earth. This would prove to be a playbook for violent, systematic persecution of the Jews under later Christian regimes for centuries to come. Two of the most eloquent preachers in early Christianity used their considerable gifts to attack the Jews. Melito of Sardis accused them of killing God around 165 in his famous dissertation Peripascha, cementing Matthew's horrific scene of the same in his Passion narrative, while John Chrysostom, the famed golden-tongued Chrysostomos, the much-lauded one, the great orator of Antioch and Constantinople, wrote a series of homilies in 387 so virulently anti-Jewish that the Nazis circulated excerpts to convince Christians to get on board with the concentration camps 1,550 years later. Can you believe that? In the meantime, Jews were legally subjugated, ghettoized, and forcibly required to identify themselves through special clothing in both Christian and Muslim kingdoms 800 years before the Holocaust. They were murdered in their hundreds of thousands or possibly millions over 1,000 years of violent pogroms that often coincided with Christian observances like Good Friday. They were forced to perform banking functions for Europe's ruling class and then cast as usurers. They were accused of killing and drinking the blood of Christian babies and practicing witchcraft. They were accused of poisoning wells during the Black Death and successfully expelled from one country after another during the medieval period, but not before being slaughtered en masse after sham trials held by ecclesiastical courts. The Holocaust was the logical extension of 2,000 years of irrational Christian hatred of the Jews and hundreds of smaller Holocausts before it. Why am I saying all this? Because I watched several YouTube videos explaining the creation of Israel in 1948 as little more than the coincidence of British colonialism meeting the Jews being interested in this renewed interest in nationalism in 19th century Europe. Just get on the bandwagon. Isn't this going to be a great experiment and fun? The claim that the state of Israel has no religious basis is a breathtaking exoneration of Christian guilt. It does have a religious basis, an unrelenting Christian persecution. And none of us here have the luxury ever of forgetting that. Never, ever. Like racism is to our nation, anti-Semitism is every bit as inescapable and intractable, perhaps even more, since it's had 2,000 years to fester and spread to every corner of our faith. When the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter murdered 11 people in 2018, he reportedly screamed, "All Jews must die," a call that echoes the Twitter trending hashtag Hitler was right these past 2 weeks. The Pittsburgh shooter cited John 8:44 on his social media with a concise summary, "Jews are the children of Satan." A certain Georgia congresswoman, who shall go unnamed, has inspired this week a Nashville shop owner to produce yellow Star of David badges reading, "Not vaccinated," equating the singular genocide of the Jews to refusing a potentially life-saving vaccine during a global pandemic. Jewish people were also blamed for the pandemic as a supposed global money-making scheme. And lest we forget, only a few years ago in Charlotte, white supremacists marched to the chant that Jews will not replace us. I am sure John's author couldn't imagine and didn't intend for any of this, especially the Tree of Life shooting or the Holocaust. But words matter. They matter. When we throw around words like genocide, apartheid, and colonialism, we may think we are justified because other Jewish leaders and organizations, human rights organizations, use that language. We may think we are simply standing with Palestine, but many others around us will believe, regardless of our intentions, that we are standing against Jews, not just in Israel, but everywhere, including right here in San Francisco. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism is a social disease of opportunity. It hears what it wants to hear and runs with it. With anti-Semitic attacks on an exponential rise here in the US and Europe, many Jewish people, who ironically share concerns over Israel's policies toward the Palestinian people, and were similarly horrified at the images coming from Gaza, are openly questioning if they can remain here, if it's safe. Please let's think before we speak. In our commitment to justice, let's exercise a special sensitivity to our language. Let's weigh our words carefully before we post or repost on social media. Remember that if we are Christian, we are never a neutral observer or objective commentator, ever. Remember Isaiah in the throne room. Reach for that coal first. I am a person of unclean lips who resides among a people of unclean lips. Resist the easy caricatures. Ask the hard and uncomfortable questions. Dig deeply into the history, and when you think you understand it, dig deeper still, because I promise you don't. Interrogate your own implicit bias, because it exists. Every Christian bears a unique responsibility to care for and protect our Jewish neighbors, even at the expense of our own comfort and our own particular agendas and ideologies, and first and foremost, from ourselves. Do not let your I be a triumphant ecclesia. Synagoga has had enough of that to last an eternity, and she deserves much better. It's past time that Nicodemus come out from the endless night of Christian anti-Semitism.